Hi, everyone. I'm Gabby Schwarz, web editor of Apollo, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Apollo 40 Under 40 Africa event. The 40 Under 40 is a project that was launched back in 2014 with the aim of celebrating the young leaders and future stars of the art world. The 2020 edition of the project, which came out back in September, was the first to focus on Africa. Today, we're going to be hearing from three of those featured on the list, and who've kindly accepted our invitation to participate in a conversation hosted by my colleague Samuel Reilly. So that's the artists Ibrahim Mahama and Jim Chuchu, and the gallerist Rakeb Sile. I'm really excited to hear their thoughts on how the African contemporary art scene has been both revisiting and reinvigorating historical art from the continent. First, before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank our very generous sponsors for the Apollo 40 Under 40 Africa, the leading South African auction house, Strauss and Co. And I'm going to hand over to Alistair Meredith, who is Senior Art Specialist and Head of Strauss and Co.'s Johannesburg Art Department, who will say a few words before we get going with the panel. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Gabby. Just a few words from me on behalf of Strauss and Company. Being an African auction house, we are naturally delighted to be a part of these kinds of discussions. We are enormously grateful to the likes of Apollo and, of course, the wonderful panelists this evening. We're always hoping to try and brighten the spotlight on art from Africa and its diaspora. Personally, this theme resonates with me. I think we'd probably all agree that African modernists, African modernisms have been largely neglected for a very long time by academics, by institutions, and by the art market itself. I'd like to think that is about to change. Strauss and Company will, of course, love to be part of that change. There is an explosion in the interest in contemporary African art, but I think we'll all agree that the foundation of the fantastic work being produced recently is very much related to historical African work, if you can call it that. So we are very happy to help support in whatever way we can, and very excited to hear the panelists. And over to you, Sam. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alistair, and thank you to everyone who's joining us, wherever you're logging in from. I'm Sam Reilly, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our three speakers to discuss a topic which is in many ways evergreen, but has perhaps in recent years been brought into sharper focus. New museums, galleries, and other initiatives in Africa have provided greater public access to historical artworks than perhaps ever before. But how might a renewed engagement with the art of the past be shaping the ways that contemporary art is made and viewed? In a moment, I'll be asking each of our speakers to spend a couple of minutes introducing two images they have chosen that, for them, encapsulate the subject of the connections between the historical and the contemporary in African art. We'll then move on to a broader discussion between us, before at the end, we'll open up to some questions from the audience in the final 15 minutes or so. Please write any questions you may have for the speakers in the Q&A box, which should appear on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be monitoring these throughout the discussion. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers tonight. Jim Chuchu is a visual artist and filmmaker from Nairobi. His films and photographs have been screened at film festivals and exhibited in galleries and museums the world over. He's also co-founding director of the Nest Collective, which has in recent years been one of three founding partners of the International Inventories Programme, which works to document Kenyan cultural objects held in public institutions around the world. The Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama has received worldwide acclaim for his large-scale installations crafted from jute sacks and other urban debris. In 2019, he founded the Savannah Centre for Contemporary Art in Tamale, the capital of the northern region of Ghana, a hub for research and local engagement with programs for artist residencies and exhibitions. The centre is committed to the development and expansion of the Ghanaian art scene. Rakeb Sile is the co-founding director of Addis Fine Art, the first white cube gallery space for modern and contemporary art in Ethiopia, which, since it was established in 2016, has grown to become one of the leading galleries in Africa, providing a prominent international platform for arts from the Horn of Africa. The gallery has since expanded from Addis Ababa to include premises in London. Thank you very much to all of you for being here with us. Jim, I wonder if you might start us off with the two images that you have selected.
I chose these two images to kind of illustrate what for me is the line between the historical and the contemporary for African art. The first image is a series of pictures that connect the history of braiding in Africa. And for me, I feel like African art, yes, there's art that sits on canvas and on sculpture, but then there's also the art that sits on people's bodies. It's in the things that people eat, the things that people dance to, the things that people say about themselves. And so for me, these braids speak to a way in which we apply art on our bodies, which is something that maybe contemporary societies have lost touch with. We now look at art as being separate from the body. And of course, Black women's hair is still a battleground today in terms of like representing decency in the workplace and all these other, ridiculous notions of public self. And the second image I chose was Fantasy Coffins from Ibrahim's country, Ghana, which for me speaks about how far beyond the canvas and far beyond the gallery and the museum space that African art allows itself to go when it is given space. The idea that you can be buried in a coffin that looks like a Trix bar or a shark or a camera is like, for me, is like a kind of applied surrealism, which again speaks to this thing of bringing art and life together and not separating them into this kind of industry that can be purchased and traded, but rather something that you can be buried in. So for me, there's something there that's quite radical, even if most people think that African art speaks more to the traditional. I'm going to use a euphemism here for worse words that have been used. Those are my two images.
Jim, we're just going to get the images up in a moment. And here we are. Jim, my apologies. I wonder if you might, now that we can see them, hear from you a little more about them.
Yeah, I mean, this image spans across generations, spans across gender even, which is a line that has become so political on the continent about what is allowed to be on a man's body versus what's allowed to be on a woman's body. I love this photo because it speaks to a wider imagination that existed in the past that has become more and more constrained as we've gone forward. And the idea that a part of a Black person's body can be a battleground because of what they choose to put on it or not. I find that interesting, and it speaks to many of the ridiculous battles that Black people and people of color are fighting in 2021. And yeah, Fantasy Coffins, Air Canada. I mean, like, there's something so unrestrained about this aesthetic, and I like the African aesthetics are often questioned in ways that I find problematic. I think the narratives around Nigerian film, for instance, I found them deeply problematic, because who decides what a film aesthetic is? Who decides what a beautiful image is? And I think there's something about this image here that says that we must allow beauty to be defined by people from where they live, not from Europe or America. And so I love this image. It's applied surrealism. It would be amazing if more people allow themselves to be buried in things that weren't so confined to the kind of rectangular coffin thing that we all do.
Who decides what a beautiful image is? It's a wonderful question. I'm sure we'll have scope to come back to it. But Ibrahim, I wonder if you could please introduce your two images.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, so I chose these two images because they are quite important to me. This image actually shows one of my colleagues at Red Clay Studio, which is my studio in Tamale, which is part of the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art, actually, of us teaching the kids drone tech in these airplanes that I bought, these different airplanes. They're actually working airplanes, but we decided to actually use them as classrooms. And the reason why we decided that was because we wanted somehow to use this object as a means to be able to open new imaginations. So how does newer technologies like drones and histories that they come with and the kind of images that they produce, particularly within this century, connect to, let's say, older objects? Can you show the next image? Yes, so it comes back also to this image of the kids in the Savannah Center looking at one of the paintings in the current exhibition of one of the Ghanaian modernist artists. And for us, it's very important because creating this institution, it's almost like an archaeological tool, a way to the infrastructure becomes a way that we can somehow dig into the past, look at older images and older practices, and somehow be able to translate them through workshops and other means onto a younger generation. And then after doing that, then we can also introduce them to the previous image in terms of, let's say, now going into maybe a new age of image making or trying to understand the world, where the world is going in terms of like experience and all that. So that is about it.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I mean, an archaeological structure digging into the past is a wonderful image. Rakeb, perhaps could you please introduce your three paintings, I believe.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me onto this incredible panel. So similar to what Ibrahim was saying, you know, we started Addis Fine Art as a commercial gallery to look at contemporary art, but also to really focus on the art historical background of the region that we're in, and looking at some of the older modernist artists that were previously completely overlooked was really part of the mission of the gallery. So I've actually chosen three images here. They're kind of in the wrong order, but I'll carry on and talk about them. This first one is by a mid-career contemporary artist called Mary Coco Brahanu. And apart from the fact that I love this painting, it really shows the link between her practice, her contemporary practice, and the old iconography of Ethiopian historical painting that is very much a foundational aspect of the art history of Ethiopia. So you know, paintings and frescoes in religious texts and in religious buildings have been really part of our history since the 4th century. So these are things that we often find in contemporary works. A lot of the artists will still be very much looking at these types of artworks to this day. Because they still persist in even the modern churches and so on, because you know, we have one of the oldest you know, Christian faiths, so these things are still part and parcel of everyday life. But this is a really good example of you know, Ethiopian iconography. I don't know if you can see, there's like what looks like somebody on a cross in this painting, and you know, these are the things that link together the painting of today, of the contemporary artists that work today, with our older, more traditional painting. And if you can go to the next painting. This one is interesting to me because Waseni Khosrow is a modernist. I would consider him as a modernist artist. He's still working today. But what he's done here is he's used one of the most well, an ancient text, an ancient alphabet that is still used in Ethiopia for a few of the languages spoken there called Ge'ez. He's taken these shapes from the alphabet, and he has, as he would call them, he's broken them down and reused them to tell a story, not like an actual story that you can read, but a visual story. And I really love the way that he's used something so ancient and yet really kind of, you know, we're still using it. It's modern, it's part of our culture in this way. And he's really one of those, he's an important artist in Ethiopia because of the fact that he's used this calligraphic medium to really showcase something that could, you know, in the next few generations could be forgotten if people don't pay attention to some of these things. And then the next one is Taddesse Mesfin. Sorry that I've taken 3 paintings. Taddesse Mesfin is a peer of Wesene, and you know, they are both, we consider them modernists. Taddesse is extremely important to our gallery and to Ethiopian art history because he's somebody that has previously been completely overlooked in the West, even though he has been a professor and a teacher and educator at the Addis School of Fine Art and Design for over 35 years. So this is somebody that we had on our top list to work with when we first started the gallery, because yes, we have lots of young artists coming through from the school, but somebody like Taddesse, if he's completely omitted from the art history, from the history of painting, then we will be missing a huge gap, because not only is he somebody that is still alive and still working, he's also still educating. So if we go back to that painting of Mary Kokob was a student of his, and a lot of her peers would attribute their practice to Taddesse and his influence in their careers. So he's somebody that we find we're just privileged to work with, but also just kind of really defines the ethos of our gallery. It's really about making connections between the very young artists that are coming out of the art school today, all the way to the modernists who really, in their era, African art was not seen as something that most people didn't even know it exists. So they did not get enough of a viewing. We feel like that's we also have to make sure that those artists like Taddesse are also getting the platform that they deserve, so that we have a fuller picture of what it is to be, say, East African or Ethiopian. And also there are regional histories that really we have to unpick. So Africa as a whole cannot, there isn't one thing that African art history is. And I think that organizations and galleries, whatever shape they take, really have to drill down into some of these regional histories for Africa to make sense as a whole, in my opinion.
Thanks very much, Rakeb. Let's try and drill down a little bit just now in the time that we've got. We've heard a little from our 3 speakers, I suppose, about the persistence of kinds of aesthetic in African art, but also the necessity of efforts to recover them. And before we get back on to some of those aesthetic questions, I suppose I wanted to begin our discussion by thinking about the more structural question. How have recently established museums, galleries, other initiatives been increasing public awareness of historical art in recent years? And perhaps we might begin with each of you saying a little more about how the initiatives you've been involved with have done so. Ibrahim, for instance, I know that last year the Savannah Centre staged a retrospective of the Ghanaian modernist Kofi Dawson, who turned 80 last year. Perhaps you might start off by talking about the importance of establishing links between generations of artists in your work.
Thank you very much, Sam. When I started thinking about the Savannah Center initially in 2014, it was mostly just thought of as a studio space for production of works and ideas. But later on, I was having conversations with Kofi Dawson, who is about 80 years plus, and one of our professors back in university, Dr. Karikacha, over the years have been encouraging students to go do their thesis and research work on older artists, because there isn't a system that somehow documents and preserves most of these artists' work. So a lot of the artists end up maybe passing away, and their works and ideas are either left to their families who don't understand what to do with it. And in the past also, it's been a case where most of these works have been in the National Museum, the collection, and they've just been there because maybe there weren't enough people in the museum who really understood what to do with these works and how to exhibit them and also like bring them into like a certain context. So the Savannah Center came to fill in that void in a way, to propose new ideas and new forms. As I said before, I thought of it more or less as an excavation tool, because Kofi Dawson isn't just the only artist, or the artists aren't the only thing that I'm interested in excavating. Also interested in excavating like modernist structures. So for instance, during the lockdown last year, I acquired one of these massive concrete silos, which was built in the 60s by our first president, Kwame Nkrumah. He was the same one also he was one of the very few presidents in our history that was interested in culture. So he built the National Museum in Accra, which has a lot of these modernist works also within it. So I thought that if we are able to build an institution that can somehow start with the older generation in terms of like doing research, encouraging artists to like work with them, bring their works into like an institutional context, and out of that maybe create workshops and open other discussions, it will really allow for a bridge within the generation. Because when we did Dawson's exhibition, there were many school pupils who we did workshops with, and Dawson had a really like direct conversation with them. So normally you wouldn't find that maybe an artist who is 80 years old or who is 80 something or 60 or 70 having a conversation, let's say, with school pupils as young as 5 years old or 10.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I'm in terms of sort of systems for documenting and preserving and the fascinating work that that you're doing, it brings to mind, Jim, I wonder if you might talk a little about the International Inventories Program, which to date I think has documented about 30,000 Kenyan cultural objects worldwide. And I wondered, how far do you think this kind of, as Ibrahim was mentioning, system for documenting and preserving can have an effect on how contemporary artists work?
Wow, I think the thing with the question about restitution is that it's this huge issue, much like any issue where you find Africans in history. You'll usually find like a lot of like historical stuff that you need to dig into. So for us, finding the records of 30,000 plus objects that are spread out in Europe and America and all these places is just the beginning of a lot of labor, because the question of restitution has always been posed to return to Africans as, but do you know what was taken from you? Do you know where it is? And you can't ask for things if you don't know what they are and where they are. So for us, this is like the first step in many steps that have to follow, and many steps that have tried to be done in the past, because this is not the first time that there are urges or movements like this happening in the continent. For us in Kenya, I think, unlike my colleagues, Ibrahim and maybe Rakeb, because I think Ethiopia also has like a healthier relationship with its history, perhaps. For us in Kenya, we have our relationship with our past is quite toxic in many terms. I think our founding father, I would hesitate to describe him as being as luminary as someone as Nkrumah. So for us at the Nest, a lot of our urges are about breaking away from our history and creating new, because sometimes when you're forging an identity as a Black person, you either access your history in this way that Ibrahim just talked about, or you break away and create something new, because sometimes you're working with an absence and a loss. So for us, our urge is to break away, to create new rather than to, which is a pity, because it's always easier to build connections with the past, but sometimes you don't have that option.
Thanks, Jim. And Rakeb, in terms of building connections, how important is it to build those ties between the older generation of artists whom you introduced earlier on with I suppose the artists who are working in Ethiopia today and coming through from the younger years?
I mean, for us, it's absolutely essential, and I think that Ethiopia has, I think, been quite insular, I think, historically, in terms of its, in general, I mean, not just in terms of art. So, we have so many obstacles to connecting with the wider world. So there's linguistic, there's cultural, and in general, we've just kind of kept ourselves to ourselves. But in saying that, we've also had waves and waves of artists actually leave the country. So we have a huge diaspora in terms of artists. So it's really, so when we first thought about the gallery, and it could have actually taken a shape of a foundation, it just was like there was so much to do that we just decided to start off with a commercial gallery, because it was, between Messiah and I, that was something that we thought we could do and we've had experience doing. But the idea really was, okay, what does it mean to be a contemporary artist from this region now? And how does that link in with our really long and the history that really hasn't been written about or really explored? So for us, it's absolutely essential. And one thing also that we were really passionate about is we really wanted to make sure the Addis School of Fine Art, which was open in the early 50s by the Emperor Haile Selassie then, is still there and has been there ever since, teaching artists, even the artists that we now work with who live in the diaspora would link their education back to that school. And to have this institution that like kind of nobody knows about, and that has kind of created so many talented artists and has a history of itself, we thought that was quite an important thing that we had, that was kind of like this hidden gem. So for us, it's absolutely essential. We're a 5-year-old gallery, and we are trying to do a lot more than really what we are capable of doing by ourselves. The good news is that recently we've got a new foundation that's being created as we speak, and potentially for next year we will have an institutional partner that we can work with to support the art school, but to also support historical scholarship, because a lot of stuff that we are discovering has never been written about, or if it has been written about, it's been written about in languages that are not accessible to the rest of the world. So there's so much work to do, honestly. And Africa is also, I always make this point and I talk, because Africa is such a huge place, and the issues that Jim has and the things that Kenya has is completely different to what we have, and what Ibrahim will have a completely different the whole society will have a different mindset to art. They'll have different opportunities and resources to work with. So I feel like it's really important that institutions and galleries really take a dive into the history and kind of make all these links back to the newest artist that is out and doing amazing work, because it all links back. There isn't one artist that isn't looking at Tadesse Mesfin's work, and Tadesse Mesfin work has links back to the Iskender Bogosian and the forefathers of modernism in Ethiopia, and then they would have had traditional art education. And so all of these things matter, and especially for a country like Ethiopia that has such a long history generally, we can't start now. We have to really make a case for educating people about how wide and how deep our culture goes.
Yes, I think building upon the existing infrastructure and building upon the work of the past is something that's sort of come up quite a lot already. Rakeb, you mentioned earlier this phenomenon, I suppose, in the post-war era, where modernist artists would often pursue careers elsewhere, and that's one of the things that I wanted to ask tonight is, how far is that true? Has that begun to change, and what might be the effect of that change? Perhaps Jim, you might like to.
I've always found the idea of, I've always built connections between the idea of extraction of resources from Africa with the very kind of contemporary idea of extraction of people. The best minds of Africa are extracted very much like coffee beans, and you send them to London and you polish them and you make them speak better, teach them about classic art, teach them how to not get drunk at cocktails and art fairs, and then make them this like internationally kind of packaged artist. It's very much what's still happening with our resources in Congo and etc. So I've always worried a little bit about the kind of the undertones of these movements. And I do understand that it is much easier to operate as an artist in London or Paris. I mean, the supplies are there, the markets are there, the people who can help build a career are there. But I think for me, artists are so necessary for societies where people don't have words for things, where people have gone through trauma. That's where the artists are needed. And so when you come in and sweep in, take all the people that you like, create an aesthetic like something like Afrofuturism, package these people in there and send them off. What does it do to the society from which they came? So yes, the trend is changing because there are more questions about who are you, who do you make your art for, where does your art come from? And if you're painting scenes from Accra in a studio in London, how real, how connected are you to those scenes? It's a pertinent question. And I'm hoping that it brings more of our artists back to build studios in Africa, because the young kids who are playing on the bikes outside, it'll be great for them to not just see the politicians in the big cars, but to also see an artist, to see a sculptor, to see all these other things that you can be as a Black person. So I'm very glad the trend is changing. It was a worrying trend, and I'm hoping that the best artists, and I said this before and I got into a little bit of trouble, I hope that our best artists will come back and build studios, operate from your countries, because London doesn't need you in the way that your country needs you.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, would you say that something similar to the trend is happening in Ghana as well? And what role might new centres in Ghana play for, I suppose, keeping Ghanaian artists working within Ghana?
Well, I think as Jim said, it's been something that has been difficult over the years. Me personally, it was very important to stay in Ghana and to work, to study fully at the university throughout my undergrad to PhD. There were many people who've done this, who've made this decision over the years. And also there's always been an encouragement through the educational model that I came from, for us as a generation of artists to somehow base our practices here. Because sometimes when you find yourself within a condition that is very difficult, maybe the easiest thing is to leave. But maybe you can also, based on that condition, you can be able to use it as a starting point or motivation to create new tools or new systems which can somehow change that existing narrative. Of course, in our history, there have been a couple of artists who've migrated, but I think that there's also been a lot of artists who've stayed here and have also worked over the years, unlike many other countries or places.
Rakeb, just to return the subject that you brought up, I wonder how far has this phenomenon begun to change in Ethiopia? I mean, are artists tending now to stay in Ethiopia?
I think that artists have always stayed. I think similar to what Ibrahim was saying, not every artist that had the opportunity to leave. I know that Tadesse Mesfin, had an opportunity to leave at some point. He had a scholarship to Russia. He did his MFA in Russia, and he came back to teach. So there are two sets of artists, I would say, artists that stayed and worked, and I mean, and were patronized by the local collector base. But for sure, we've had waves and waves of migration generally. So within those waves, artists also left for various reasons. I think that when we first started the gallery, it was also a question for us, you know, would it be easier to open in London, where I live, or LA, where Masai lived? And the answer was yes, it would have been much easier. But I think, going back to the point that Jim was making, you know, we really didn't want an export business. You know, we kept saying, what are we doing? Are we exporting? Or are we trying to also build something locally? Because the problem is, if there are no institutions, or if there seems to be no commercial value to the artwork at home, there's, you know, you lose kind of the foundation. You know, people need to understand that art is valuable, you know, financially, monetarily, also culturally, right? So having a gallery in Addis, honestly, the first couple of years, you know, people were just waiting for us to close because there was no real business case to doing that. But I think what we've proved is, once we give it the investment that it requires, other people will take notice locally and outside. And I think that it's going to take more people to make that kind of move. And I feel like artists are really at the forefront of this. A successful artist that can come back and say, no, this is where I need to be. Or even to just for other artists to see somebody like Taddessa Mesfin go from, you know, a salaried professor to somebody who is wildly successful at home is really important. It gives it kind of fires up the imagination of younger artists that actually, you know what, being an artist is valuable, and it's something that is possible for me to do while I'm here. And sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but yes, it's really important that things happen on the ground, and it's harder. And you know, for sure, Masai and I think we're going to write a book one day as to all of the obstacles and you know, all the crazy stories we've accumulated over the years trying to do what we're doing. But it's worth it. I feel like we have changed the game to a degree on the ground, and I think that's really important. And some artists are coming back. I know, I can't say who, but there are a couple of artists that are coming back. They're going to set up their studios, and as more and more artists become successful at home, they build their studios and they think of other things. And as Ibrahim said, they will change the game. They'll change the systems for the better, and that's always good.
For sure. Thanks, Rakeb. I think this is a good moment to move on to thinking about, I suppose, what kind of effect these trends, these new initiatives might have on an aesthetic kind of framework upon the ways that contemporary art is made and viewed. I mean, the obvious place to start here, we've got two artists. Ibrahim, in what ways do you draw on previous forms of African art making in your own practice?
Well, I came from the background of painting throughout my undergrad to PhD, but I guess there's always been this question about what painting is, the history of painting, the legacy of it, and also just the general aesthetics of it. So in as much as I start my ideas or my production with, let's say, making drawings, mostly which are even more architectural, because I mostly have to think spatially first and think about even sometimes designing a space, even before thinking about, let's say, making a drawing or a collage that goes into it. But I guess I was trying more and more to produce works that could somehow stretch and expand the meaning of painting. Because in a lot of history, like when you go to many art schools, particularly on the continent, like but also I've been to many schools, of course, in Europe, which are still very rigid in terms of how they teach what painting is about. For instance, as an artist, if I'm going to use maybe Karl Marx or Rancière as a starting point to think about the form that a painting can take, then you realize that maybe abandoned infrastructure that maybe artists can intervene upon, which when used as a space which is not maybe within the context of the white cube, can influence maybe a new generation of artists with regards to the kind of images that they're going to produce and the specific form that those images are going to take. So I'm very much interested in the older generation and how the idea of image making went, but I'm also interested in how that can influence us within this generation to be able to produce new kinds of images.
Is there a sense that what you're doing is sort of establishing a continuity with generations to come as well, I suppose?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jim, perhaps you might like to discuss. So how do you draw on previous forms of African art making?
Again, for me, it's very much about severance, and it's for many reasons. I think as a queer man, first of all, there is this idea that queerness is un-African. So for me, growing up and kind of forming my identity, I always grappled with this idea that there was something about me that was not African, which is this ridiculous kind of idea that's very politically expedient. And so I work from absence, I work from loss, I work from absence, because how do you create an identity for yourself when you're told that the identity you have is somehow faulty or broken or overly influenced by the West, which is just ridiculous. So my works before have been about what does God look like? What does an African God look like? When you pray, who do you see in your mind? And when I ask my fellow Kenyans this question, it gets abstract because it's a difficult question to ask people. Who do you see when you pray? What do you imagine heaven looks like? Are there Black people in heaven? Do angels look like you? All these questions about, like, okay, you're this Black person navigating in the world, but how much of the world belongs to you? How much of the world reflects who you look like and who you are? So for me, yeah, the connection with the historical is quite is a fraught space for me of unbelonging.
It's a fascinating.
And there must be room for people like that. There must be room for people to create new lines, to create new belongings, and that's what absence allows you to do.
Absolutely. And Rakeb, in terms of creating new belongings, are there any artists in your stable you can point to that are particularly invested in looking at and repurposing the art of the past?
So, I mean, I've mentioned Wasene as somebody that will look at, you know, an ancient calligraphy and kind of put it into his contemporary works, for example. But I just want to pick up on something that Jim just said. There is definitely room for this type of diversity. And I think that, again, going back to the African art question, there is such a huge multiplicity that needs to be explored in this space. So, and every country has its own history and its own trajectory into the future of art as well. So it really, these discussions are so important, because I know Kenya and Ethiopia are, you know, neighbors, but we have completely separate identity forming cultures and a relationship with the West. You know, we were a communist country for, you know, 2 decades, which is complete. So this point I always want to reiterate is that when we talk about African art, we need to make room for all of these multiplicities and we need to learn about these things. So in our stable, a lot of our artists, because of just the way that their education has gone and because of where they are, they pull on a lot of their cultural identity for the work that they do. Even the very, very young artists that are coming out of the art school, the photographers, they are talking about their identity as they see it. And, you know, when you hear Jim speak, the perspective of his peers or his you know, his practice is completely opposite to that. It's something about, you know, working from a place of loss is slightly will get you to a different point. So I just wanted to make that point, is that, you know, these are such important discussions that we're having, because it really puts to the fore that Africa is such a big place, and that there is so much to say, and there's so much to for artists to speak about on the continent.
So there's the sense that there's a balance to be struck, I suppose, between digging down locally and inquiring about what you find in front of your nose, but also building these broader connections between art centres across, as you point out, you know, a vast continent with multiple different traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that having these discussions between all of these institutions is important, but also when we are presenting African art to the West or the wider art market, you know, although, you know, the term African art has taken hold, and it's kind of now in the imagination of all of the collectors, you know, what does that actually mean? What does that mean when it comes to Kenya? What does that mean when it comes to Ghana, Ethiopia, where you know, these it takes, all of these things should take you back to a different point in history, because they're all come from different places. And I think that people, the more the wider art world starts digging deep, the better it will be for kind of the future of African art, because it's not one thing, and it's not only a couple of things, it's so much more to discover.
Sure. Ibrahim, I wonder if you have anything to add on this question of I suppose the balance between local research and the connections that need to be built between nations and art traditions.
Oh, well, I guess it's very important. For me, I think that I've always been interested in the idea of the local, yeah. But at the same time, I guess we're also very much interested in how that connects to a much more global, like a global conversation. I think sometimes the dangers that we make is that, so for instance, in a lot of art schools, they might think that maybe studying about the traditions of, let's say, Western art is not really necessary for maybe artists locally who are practicing or who want to like explore certain ideas or maybe a certain research process and all that. But art is global and it's universal, in as much as I think, as Jim said before, it comes down to the artists and the art community. There is a certain sense of responsibility that we somehow have to exercise in the way that we produce and what we do. So for instance, if I use SCC as an example, when we started doing research on like the older artists, modernist artists, not just Kofi Dawson, but Ajman Osei or maybe an architect, we would spend a lot of time going through their archives and looking at materials that they have and finding ways in which we could somehow redocument that, recatalog that, and also use that as a starting point for maybe a certain kind of new discussion or a new form of aesthetics or recontextualizing these same artists' works. So, but we also are not just going to present it just within a local context. We want to be able to present it in such a way that there is some kind of a continuity and also a conversation between what they are doing now and what it means also to the general history of, let's say, painting or sculpture or textiles or whatever, or architecture in a much more global sense. Yeah.
I'm conscious that this is perhaps not a topic to be brought up briefly, but in terms of establishing continuity, I do just want to ask about I suppose, the restitution debates and what role you think that the restitution of objects can have in alerting people in Africa to their artistic traditions.
Well, it's important. Yeah, for me, I find it to be honest, I find it difficult when it comes to issues regarding restitution, because I think that first and foremost, on a continent, we need a lot more, we need to take a lot more responsibility for even what there is here already. Because this conversation keeps coming back again and again, and I'm very much interested in restitution just beyond even return of objects and other things, but also these objects have really taken a new form and have produced maybe certain value forms over the decades and over the centuries. So I'm interested in how all that is able to move from one place to the other. I have been having a conversation with the National Museum in Accra about paintings and objects which have been in the collection for more than half a century, which no one has ever seen before because they never really had a budget to show these things. So by investing into the kind of infrastructure through SCC or Red Clay, or buying old public monuments and like converting them into cultural public institutions, we're able to somehow take these objects and then be able to provide very new context for them. So one example is, we have two examples. We have a Sputnik in the collection of the museum, which is people barely know it exists. And it was one of the first satellites that was sent into orbit. So, and the Soviets donated it to Ghana like many, many decades ago.
So one very interesting question that's popped up is, how far in these three countries, so in Ethiopia, Ghana and Kenya, is state support for displaying the previous generation's work possible or desirable even? Jim, perhaps that's one you might like to field first.
State support for Kenya, tricky question. I think in the 80s, we had a president who was not happy with the arts because that was where the critique about his government was coming from. So he worked hard to dismantle the civil society, the universities, anything to do with the arts and expression. And I think in many ways, Kenya has never really recovered from that because, again, this line between the past and the present, there was a severance there that was not colonial, it was very post-colonial. And so the state's attitude to expression and even the rights of the citizens to be free and to express themselves has a lot of toxic shadows of both colonial attitudes of the British to the natives, and then also this kind of post-colonial kind of fear of dissent. And so what does state support mean from an institution that has this history? Like the word you used was desirable, and yeah, state support in Kenya might not even be desirable, but it's also not there. I think our state likes to keeps its support for the arts to heritage, which is the museums, the safe stuff, the dead stuff, because the living stuff is where you get all the problems. So there isn't, I mean, if you look at our education system, the arts have been cut out. So to be a formally trained artist in Kenya is like, you have to leave, which is sad. I go to other countries and you see like City of Toronto has sponsored this exhibition, and you're like, this is completely alien to me as an idea that the state could invest in the expression of its citizens. It's a beautiful idea, but it's not one that is desirable or even happening in my country.
No, absolutely. I'm moving on to a question for Rakeb. Is there a local clientele in Addis for contemporary art, and is that how the gallery has survived? Or I suppose, is that how something that you're looking to stoke and to build?
Yes. So when we first started in 2016, I think that, you know, the idea of buying from a gallery wasn't necessarily, you know, it was kind of an alien concept. I mean, there are artists and there are artist studios, and there, you know, as I said, the art school is there. So there's like a, you know, yearly show that they put on. So, you know, there are collectors there, but the way that they collected was different. So the idea is that they collected directly from artists. And this kind of didn't give any kind of protection for the artist. And it was, you know, it's just a one-off type relationship. So when we set up the gallery, it was, I think it took the local collectors a while to just figure out what we were doing. Why are you doing this? This is just, it's, you're not needed here kind of thing. And I think that after, I think it was after the beginning of the third year that people really realized what we were doing. We were essentially building the career of an artist. And that had never really been done before. We offered actual representation right there from where the artists live, directly into our London space. So it was more of a global representation, and we were able to like help artists build on what they have already built on their art. So I think that once people kind of understood what we were doing and that we were taking this art to a wider audience, which then means that they have competition. You know, if people see this work, they'll buy it because it's good and it's, you know, it stands up to the global standard and all that. I think it became quite. We created something that we thought would never really happen until maybe many years down the road, which is a really good, small but really, really dedicated core of supporters at home now, where, you know, so, you know, we have sellout shows at home. We have a thriving, small but thriving collective base that we're working with. And the great thing about this is that as a young gallery, we're also enticing younger collectors to come in. You know, collectors that are in their 30s, they're doing really well. There's lots of growth happening in Ethiopia. And with that, we kind of grow with them, or they grow with us. So we literally started from scratch in Addis, and the first couple of years were really, you know, it was rocky, to say the least. But I think now we feel really confident that, you know, even if another gallery opens, or 2 or 3 gallery open in that city, there could be a thriving scene. And I think that's what we wanted to at least start when we first began.
Sure. So it's building the scene around you, I suppose. We've got time for one more. Ibrahim, this is broad, but I think it's certainly pertinent. Can African art ever be useful as a term, or is it too broad?
No, I don't. For me, I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, African art is African art at the end of the day. Yeah, because I think, yeah, African art. Yeah, of course. To be more specific, if you say maybe the history of Ghanaian art, or the history of, let's say, Egyptian art or Ethiopian art or Kenyan art, but I think when we talk about African art, then we're talking about, let's say, collective aesthetics, and we're also talking about maybe certain collective memories and experiences through, one, the production of work on the continent historically. Secondly, in terms of the infrastructure that has been available for it, that has also influenced artists in terms of the kind of objects or paint works that they produce. Because there are a lot of artists on the continent who have the capacity to produce certain ideas, but they wouldn't because there isn't the infrastructure for it. So at the end of the day, we have a collective condition which we have to deal with, which also goes a long way to characterize a lot of work that is being produced on the continent. So certainly, if we talk about African art, then at least it gives us a lot more responsibility to know that we are all in this together, and we must strive to be a lot more responsible so we can create new spaces or new systems that can also influence like how the shape that art takes going forward.
Which is a fabulous note to end on. And in the spirit of the collective, can I just say thank you very much to all of our speakers for joining me from Kenya, from Ghana, from the UK, and thank you to all of you for joining us as well.